If you practice yoga, it's extremely likely that you've heard, it's possible that you even say, that transitioning from so-called open hip postures like Warrior Two and Half Moon Pose to so-called closed hip postures like Warrior One or Warrior Three is unsafe, it's unstable, that you're grinding the hip, and that you can damage the labrum. In this video, I want to unpack this claim or just this underlying belief. And in doing so, I want to look at what is the possible mechanism of injury in this transition and whether or not this is a consistent thing that as yoga students and teachers, we should really be concerned about in our teaching. The quick cut to the chase bottom line is no. Transitioning between Warrior One and Warrior Two, Half Moon Pose, Warrior Three, or any of these common pelvis facing one direction, pelvis facing the other direction within a sequence, it is extremely unlikely that these are going to cause trouble for anyone's hips. They don't fit the known conditions for mechanical disruption of the labrum via femoral acetabular impingement. And actually rotating the pelvis on the femurs and rotating the femurs within the pelvis is a really normal, healthy action, and that's really what we're doing when we're transitioning between these poses. So let's look at this a little bit deeper and see if there actually are some other things that we should pay greater attention to when it comes to hip and labrum safety. In fact, if you stay till the end of this, I'm going to show you the poses that I'm much more concerned about with regards to grinding the hip or producing femoral acetabular impingement. I'm Jason Crandell. I've been a respected yoga teacher for over 25 years, and I created this channel to give us more information, to help us think more critically and deeply about certain aspects of the yoga practice, and to help support and inspire our students. First, and I think that this is important, I don't actually really enjoy the transition between Warrior One and Warrior Two, or Warrior Two and Warrior One, or anything where the pelvis is facing forward and then it's facing laterally, because I find it's a little awkward, and because more or less everything has to change position. If I'm going from Warrior One to Warrior Two, I have to change the position of the back foot, I have to change the rotation of the back leg, I have to change the rotation of the pelvis, I have to change the rotation kind of everything. Same thing in reverse. So it's not my sequencing preference. In fact, honestly, I can't think of the last sequence where I've taught Warrior Two to Warrior One or Warrior One to Warrior Two. It's probably been over 20 years. But that's based on preference, not based on health, not based on safety, not based on anything rooted in a deeper, more scientific understanding of the body. Second, and I'll keep this brief, and I know this might be a little bit uptight and tedious, which I will acknowledge at times I'm uptight and tedious, but I don't really love the language open and closed hips because that's not really what's happening. When we're dealing with the pelvis and we're dealing with the ball and sockets, the femoral acetabular joint or the coxal joint, nothing's opening and nothing's closing. It's something that's turning. It's turning one direction or it's turning the other direction. We don't have something opening, we don't have something closing. So when you go from Warrior One to Warrior Two and you create that lateral pelvic rotation, it's just lateral pelvic rotation, lateral. If I'm rotating the pelvis towards the front leg, it's just medial pelvic rotation. Nothing's opening, nothing's closing. If I'm rotating the pelvis away from the front leg, so going into Warrior Two, yes, I am increasing the length on the inner thigh muscles, and I'm opening the angle of the medial part of the hip socket, but the hip socket is a circle. So if I'm opening or I'm increasing the angle on the medial side, I'm decreasing it on the posterior side. Similarly, if I go from Warrior Two to Warrior One, I'm rotating the pelvis towards the front leg. That means I'm decreasing the angle of the joint on the medial side, but I'm opening it or I'm lengthening it on the lateral side. So I tend to stay away from open hip and closed hip postures in terms of naming protocol. And I just say poses where the pelvis is turning away from the front leg, or poses where the pelvis is turning towards the side of the mat, or poses where the pelvis is turning towards the front leg, or poses where the pelvis is turning towards the front of the mat. The language that often comes up, transitioning from one plane to another, so doing what the pelvis does in normal life, which is this pelvic rotation while bearing load on the legs. That's something that the pelvis does. That's a healthy, normal action for a human body. The language around this is often it's going to grind. If we're going to rotate the pelvis from warrior 1 to warrior 2, or half moon to warrior 3, or warrior 3 to half moon, the language is often we're grinding or wearing away at the hip. So what do people mean when they're talking about this? Because this is really important, everybody, and this is something we always want to be able to think through. If I or someone else warns you against something, especially if that's something that the body does, then there has to be an identifiable and consistent mechanism by which that thing we're doing is problematic. So what are people talking about when they're talking about the hip grinding? Fortunately for all of us, I have a helpful, insensitive, and already disarticulated helper. And we can start to see this concept or this mechanism of grinding a little bit more clearly. So when someone is accurately talking about grinding in the hip, invariably what's being described is a very unfortunate circumstance called femoral acetabular impingement, or FAI for short. So femoral acetabular impingement is what we're talking about when we're talking about grinding and labral disruption, okay? Now, FAI stands for femur and acetabulum, femoral acetabular impingement, meaning they're pressing together to an unfavorable and disruptive degree. And what lines the acetabulum? A mechanism in the body called the labrum. Shoulders have labrums, hips have labrums. And I'm not going to go into all the details of a labrum. I got an anatomy course you can check out if you're interested in that. But the labrum can essentially, under the condition of femur and acetabulum grinding and impinging upon each other, that labrum can get torn, it can get injured. And that is a real and very unpleasant scenario. And it absolutely can, unfortunately, happen in many aspects of life, including our yoga practice. If you want to learn more about femoral acetabular impingement and common labrum injuries, I'm going to put in the description below a couple of links to the National Institute of Health and some of the meta-analysis on labrum injuries, causes, and dysfunctions, and especially femoral acetabular impingement. So if you want to take this to an even deeper level, I'll provide that information for you. There are 3 conditions that are known and measurable that are the most common causal variables for this grinding, this femoral acetabular impingement. And spoiler alert, really none of these things are happening in the transition between the poses that we're talking about. So variable number 1, the hip typically needs to be flexed at a minimum of 90 degrees, okay? Now the reality is some people in fact do get all the way down to a 90-degree femoral acetabular angle in warrior 1 and warrior 2, but it's actually very, very rare. You would have to have the knee in the exact same plane as the acetabulum in warrior 1 and in warrior 2. But again, it's almost always that we're at a much lower degree of flexion. But I will admit that first variable plausibly could be satisfied. But the next 2 don't happen at all in this transition. So the second variable that is a possibility for grinding the hip is hip flex 90 degrees and hip adducted. The hip is not adducted in the transition between any of these poses. The hip isn't really even adducted in the poses themselves. And I think that this is an important moment. It's very rare that people say, don't do warrior 2, don't do warrior 1, don't do warrior 3, don't do half moon pose, they'll grind your hip. It's all about the transition. And when we're making the transition in any direction between any of these poses, the hip is never moving into an adducted position. And I'll show you just in case in case it just isn't like clear what that is. So when you are in Gomukhasana, the hip is adducted. So if you look at my, let's stay consistent here. If you look at my right thigh, okay, if I put this model of a femur here, this is where the hip is at 90 degrees, or this is where my femur is at 90 degrees, right here. But if you look at my real leg is adducted. This leg is not adducted. When you're in Warrior One, this is not happening, okay? You're not in a position where the hip is really even close to adduction, and you certainly are not close to adduction in the transition. The third most common condition is internal rotation, and understand these are simultaneous. So hip flexed, minimum of 90 degrees. Hip adducted. Hip internally rotated. You're not going anywhere near any of these positions in the transitions we're talking about or the poses we're talking about, but stay tuned and we'll see there actually are a lot of poses that do satisfy these conditions and may be much more problematic than these transitions. If you dig deep in some of the sports science research on labral tears, another scenario that you're going to find other than femoral acetabular impingement is quick, forceful, explosive rotational movements. We don't do this. We don't do this anywhere in yoga, ever. Maybe jumping back to chaturanga, jumping forward, we could almost make a case. But what we're talking about is quick cutting, right? So imagine everybody racket sports. Imagine a tennis player, right? Those quick, powerful, cutting, explosive movements. A figure skater getting ready to turn, right? It's getting ready to jump and blast off. A soccer or a football player making quick cut transitions. For me, a hockey player growing up, these very quick, explosive, rotational, pivoting movements. But this just isn't anything close to what we're doing when we're transitioning between Warrior One and Warrior Two and so on. So, does making these transitions fit any of the known measurable conditions for actual hip grinding, for actual hip instability issues? And the answer is no, it just doesn't stand up to test and it doesn't stand up to reason. And I want to tell you this from the bottom of my heart. If you've been saying those things, it's okay. Everybody, we have to have a ton of grace for our teachers and for ourselves. We're all just doing our best. And there's so much that we just don't know, and we're continuing to grow and we're continuing to learn. And so if you're watching this episode and you're like, well, I say that, just don't. It's totally okay. I can't tell you the number of times as a yoga teacher I've changed course. I spent all sorts of years saying all sorts of things that I don't say any longer because I know better now. And that's part of the reason that I have this channel, is so we can have empathy for ourselves, but also have the critical thinking skills to be a very sophisticated contemporary yoga teacher. Of course, if anything does not feel good or feel appropriate or feel symptomatic or injurious in your practice, don't do it. Whether it's these transitions or other poses, you listen to your own body and make your best decisions based on the feedback and your own self-knowledge. Finally, I promise those of you that stay till the end, what are the poses that are much more likely to actually grind the hip, to produce this femoral acetabular impingement than these transitions, which are actually kind of a red herring, when there are several poses that are much more likely to be problematic for students that have this kind of impingement. Deep hip flexion postures, especially deep hip flexion postures with some sorts of femoral adduction, okay? So first, deep hip flexion postures, especially passive hip flexion postures. Happy baby pose. I'm just doing it on one side, but happy baby pose, especially when the hand is on the outside and the thigh is pulled in, because we have deep hip flexion and we have a little bit more adduction to the femur. This is actually a common killer for people in the front of the hip. Child's pose, especially child's pose with the knees together, which is a little bit adducted. This is often a challenge for people that have femoral acetabular impingement. The one I showed earlier, Gomukhasana. Gomukhasana can be really problematic. I love these poses, but we have to be really clear about their functional reality and also what to look for. But let me go through these poses first. What do we have here? Deep hip flexion, greater than 90 degrees. What do we have here? The femur is externally rotated, which is a bit of a saving grace, but it's adducted. So as I come forward, it's much more likely that I can get that pinch or that femoral acetabular impingement. All of the seated twists, where the foot, look everybody, where the foot goes across the body. Why? Deep hip flexion, femoral adduction. And then as I rotate, I'm actually, by rotating, and hugging that leg in, I'm creating a little bit more hip flexion and adduction. So Gomukhasana, Ardha Matsyendrasana, poses like this, variations of Marichyasana 3. Now, I am not a doctor, and this does not serve the purpose of any diagnostic feature whatsoever. And with all due respect, if you think it does, you're a crazy person, and that's okay. A crazy person can watch this, but the hallmark symptom of what we would want to listen to is not all injuries are symptomatic, so I want to be clear about that. But the thing that we would look for in our body from a sensory experience of knowing whether or not one or more of those poses was more problematic would actually be a feeling of pinch on the front of the hip. So if I'm doing something like happy baby pose, or I'm doing something like low lizard lunge, or I'm doing something like child's pose, or I'm doing one of these twists, and in any of those poses, I'm getting a feeling of pinch and pain or a lot of pressure and discomfort on the front of the hip, I'm gonna take that as a signal to back way out of that hip flexion and start to work a little bit differently in those poses, or maybe avoid them if I have more reason within myself to be concerned about the health and happiness of my hips. As always, here's the pitch. If you like this content, please like, please subscribe, all those things. If you want to study with me and learn more, go to the links down below, check out my courses, my trainings, and everybody, I just really appreciate you taking the time to listen and consider this work and help your students be well.